Hi and welcome back. Today I'm celebrating reaching 25,000 subscribers. Thanks so much. And 320 in my Patreon group, which is fantastic. And also almost 3 years to the day since I started watercolour painting. It's been such an exciting journey so far and I've learned so much, but still so much more to learn. So today I'm going to be using my handmade watercolour paints that I make from Sennelier dry pure pigments and binder to paint these lovely loose semi-abstract poppies. I've been experimenting with making my own paint for a couple of years now, ever since I saw a demonstration by Smoothie77 about how to make them. Please follow the link below in the description if you want to see how to make your own watercolour paints. First I'm going to mix up some puddles of French vermilion and mineral violet in my palette and a bit of viridian hue as well. My paper is Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper, 1/4 imperial size. It's taped to my board and my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees. I'm wetting the paper all over with my large Chinese haki brush. This is an old bamboo brush that I found a couple of years ago on eBay. I haven't been able to find one similar since, so I'm afraid I can't help you with where to get one from. I've recently bought some sheep's hair ones, which I will be trying out, hopefully in a demonstration soon, and I'll let you know how I get on with those. I think those are widely available. I'm just using my pre-mixed mixtures of French vermilion and then mineral violet and then lastly a little bit of viridian to splash about on the wet paper and then tip and tilt the paper around to allow the wash to run. It doesn't really matter how it looks at the moment. I'm just looking for a nice pale softly diffused red, pink and green background for my poppies. Adding a little bit more paint here and there, and the paper's very wet, so this will all softly diffuse and run nicely into the paper. I'm using a large squirrel mop. I think this is a Winsor & Newton squirrel mop and I think it's a size 6. But I always say it doesn't matter what brushes you use whichever brushes you're comfortable with or have got. And for loose painting, it often works that in the early stages of the painting, the larger the brush, the better the outcome, because you will disturb the paper less and have lovely clean washes that don't look overworked. Now I'm just allowing my paint to run down the page, having tilted the paper, and now I'm tipping it back and allowing it to run down in that direction as well. I like the amount of French vermilion that's there now. I think that will make a lovely sort of distant field of poppies for my foreground poppies. And this is now a similar mixture of mineral violet, just dotting that in here and there just to add a slightly different shade to the reds and pinks. And then you can see it's diffusing nicely into my background. My cotton paper will stay wet for quite a long time, and that's really useful when you're painting wet in wet backgrounds like this. It gives you the chance to work gently with pale washes until you build up the kind of background you like. This is viridian hue and I'm gently scrubbing it lightly into the gaps around the French vermilion and the mineral violet, and this should softly diffuse into the other colours and just complete the look of my faded background field. I'm flicking in some colour now using a round brush This again is just diffusing gently and giving me a little bit of texture. Some slightly darker spots in some places, but not too dark, not too pronounced. You can see that these marks are starting to run down because the board's at an angle, so gravity is taking them down and softening them back into the background. It's dried off now, and you can see that it's dried back slightly paler, but it's a nice sort of misty background for the poppies. I wanted it to be completely dry before I painted my poppies in next. I've got a small Chinese calligraphy brush here, and I'm using the same colours. This is French vermilion, and where I drew in or sketched in the very vague rough shapes of my poppies, I'm putting in washes of paint and then adding water to the paint and softening the paint down in places, adding little dots of stronger colour here and there. So I'm creating a sort of wet in wet environment in each petal in order to build up different shades of colour and different tones of contrast. This is quite a rich mixture of French vermilion, and then softened back with clean water. And you can see how the paint is sort of, bursting out from the stronger areas and softening as it goes into where the water has been added. And we're starting to build up the look of petals. A little bit of stronger paint right on the edge. It's staying put on the edge, but softly diffusing into the petal itself. I don't mind if I leave some little white or unpainted areas where the background is just showing through. I'm looking for a combination of soft and hard edges here, of darks and lights. Now, the darks are going to be produced mostly by dropping in mineral violet into the red and helping to really intensify the shadow. And because the board is at a slope of about 45 degrees, the paint is running down towards the bottom, so I'm getting a nice build-up of dark at the base of the flower where the shadows would be. Using the tip of the calligraphy brush, I'll pull down a stem for the poppy. The wet paint in the flower will follow that line. I might have to dab it out every now and again, but I should get a nice transition or soft transition between the base of the flower and the stem. Adding clean water around some of the edges, just softening back, making it slightly paler in some places and softening the edges, so we've got sort of lost and found edges. Some of the edges I'm bringing back with slightly darker paint, others that I've softened out I'm just leaving them to blur into the background, just to give that sort of ethereal, semi-abstract, dreamy look that you can get with some beautiful watercolour paintings. I've not really done much experimentation painting flowers, so this really is a bit of an experiment, but I think poppies are a good place to start because they're quite simple shapes and you can play around within the large petals with your textures and your tones, your contrasts and your wet in wet. It's a good way to practice. If you get quite a bit of paint running down into your stem as the paint will follow the wet line that you've painted, then just dab it out a bit with a tissue. And I'm going to go back in with more of this mineral violet and deepen up the contrasts and the tones and the hues around the base of that petal again. I'm starting to like the way it's looking. I'm going to keep working on it. It's a lovely way to paint colour mixing on the page like this rather than colour mixing in the palette. I shall leave that flower to allow the wet paint to dry a little bit more, and when it's just damp I can add some more colour into it. So now I'll start painting the next flower in exactly the same sort of way, following the outlines that I've drawn in, using a mixture of soft and hard edges, paint and clean water to soften back and spread out the paint that I apply, and then darkening it up in some areas to show shadow and folds in the petals. I like a small calligraphy brush like this for painting these kinds of very painterly flowers. It holds quite a lot of paint for a small brush, so that you can push quite a lot of paint around into the petals, and likewise you can push a lot of water into that paint to soften and spread it out very quickly. But then you can go in with the tip and clean water, and you can either lift out paler areas, or you can just feather out the edge very lightly, so it sort of looks like the ragged edges of the petals. These brushes are very versatile. You can of course use a round brush with a good point for exactly the same sort of effects. Dotting in more of that lovely rich mineral violet, then more of the French vermilion. I very rarely use these kinds of bright colours, but when I do, I really enjoy it, because there's something very, very satisfying and therapeutic about painting flowers in such beautifully vibrant colours. Softening back with the clean damp water. I think it's a good idea when painting flowers to sometimes have two water jars, one that you wash your brushes out in, and another one that you keep as clean as possible just for softening back. Just dab out any little runs that you might get. It doesn't matter, this is semi-abstract, and I'm going to be spattering some paint later on, so any marks that are made here will just add into the effects that I get at the end. Just keeping it as loose and as abstract as possible. I've just pulled down 2 stems from here because it's hopefully by the end it'll look like 2 poppies, one in front of the other just there. The mineral violet makes a really good job of putting in the shadows once there's enough of the French vermilion in there. Just going to add in a few more sort of random stems for distant poppies or leaves and grasses, things like that, seed heads. And all the time I stop every now and again and look at it from a distance and see how it's looking, maybe half close my eyes, because squinting at it like that helps me to see how my contrasts are coming along, to make sure that there's enough darks in there. I'm just using a watery mix of viridian hue and the calligraphy brush, and just putting in a few hints of drooping buds or seed heads on the stems here and there. I don't want too much detail here. The stars of the show are going to be my poppy heads. Around the base, I'm going to try and create quite a sort of a loose and abstract sort of foliage and poppy design. And to that end, I've just flicked up a few more stems, all at slightly sort of different angles to each other, but mostly tending up towards, from the bottom left towards the top right. And now with my small squirrel mop brush, I'm going to use the viridian hue, a fairly watery mixture, and just randomly paint on sort of leaf shapes and blobs and lines and things. Just build up a little bit of texture there. Nothing too dark. I'm going to build it up across the painting, keeping my paint nicely wet, because in a moment I'm going to add more red and violet to it using the spatter technique, and I want the spatter to diffuse nicely into these leaf shapes, so which is why I'm using quite a wet mixture of paint here. I'm making sure my brush strokes come up over the tape at the bottom, and maybe dabbing back a little bit with the tissue to take off a bit of the paint, make it look even sort of lighter and mistier. Just get some paint into this poppy here, using the small calligraphy brush again, and the same technique, trying to build up a nice sort of balance of soft and hard edges, darks and lights, red and violet. I'm trying to keep the shapes and shades and hues balanced with the other two flowers. This flower is more sort of open, more faces us, so eventually I'll have the sort of seeds and seed heads showing in the centre of that flower. I just want the bottom petals to look like they're just sort of curling out and downwards, so they're sort of foreshortened, which is why they look such a different shape from the rest. Hopefully once I've got all the lights and darks in, it should work. Some slightly darker paint into the still wet edge, just to add a sort of ragged dimension and a looser, softer look to the outline in places. As I've said before, it's that combination of soft and hard edges that really helps for a loose painting to work. And to that effect, I'm just softening up some of the other edges as well. I've painted in off camera some veins and a little bit more shape and shading into these flowers, and I think they're beginning to come to life. They're starting to look a lot more the way that I want them to. And now, while everything's still a little bit damp around the base, I'm flicking in very large drops of French vermilion, and you can see it's just diffusing into the still damp pale leaf shapes and really giving me some lovely effects. It's like really finishing off the base of the painting, so that we get these sort of misty, blurry, semi-abstract leaves and poppies and buds and seed heads, etc. And now I'm flicking with the brush just to get some smaller spatter here and there, just to really bring the painting together. I'm flicking in and spattering some of the mineral violet as well. Again, that's diffusing with the leaf patterns and the French vermilion spatterwork and blobs too. So it's all beginning to build up and come together, and we're having some much nicer but softly diffused shapes and marks just coming together. So I'm just going to work on my poppies a little bit more, softening, darkening, adding more of the mineral violet in places. They're all still fairly damp in places, so if I'm careful I can touch rich mixtures of the paint into those areas and they will still diffuse. Gravity will bring the shadows down, or the shapes down, and the patterns. Flicking up with some tapered brush strokes just to add more of those kind of illusions of the delicate veins of the petals. I'm now going to leave it to completely dry before I add the finishing touches. It's now completely dry and I've made up a nice rich mixture of French vermilion, but this time I've added ultramarine blue, again my homemade ultramarine blue deep, to make this really dark, rich, almost blackish purple or purplish black. And I'm going to add in my very darkest shadows and contrasts, being careful not to overdo this too much, and adding in the sort of shapes and suggestions of seed heads and seeds in the centre of the poppies and the darkest darks. Darkening up here will really give me a differentiation between these two flowers, the one in the front and the one behind. I'm being careful that as I add the detail that I don't add too much. I'm working across all the flowers with this nice rich mixture of French vermilion and ultramarine blue deep. This small calligraphy brush is just a very cheap generic Chinese brush that I bought. I think it was a set of 3 that was about £5 online. It's got a nice point, so I'm just going to use it to darken up the base of that flower. And the stem where it's just in shadow. Just strengthening up some of those main flowers a little bit. Sort of a broken line through some of the, so it looks as if some of this blurry foliage and flowers are in front of those stalks and stems. And again, I've just stepped back and had a little look and decided I need a bit more on the edge here, so I'm just dotting and dashing in Just a few dabs to create a few more hard edges. I think I need to extend the petals out from this one a little bit more, so I'm going to paint into them, into that edge using the calligraphy brush, and then soften back in a minute and just blend those edges together. A few more dots with that dark paint. Clean damp brush just now, softening that last little ragged edge, just blending it a bit more into the body of the flower. And I think I'm going to leave it there. I think that's just about enough, as much as I want to do for this loose poppy experiment. I'm going to remove the tape and have a look and see how it looks with its nice clean white border. I think it really shows the soft diffusion of the background when we paint wet in wet with just using a hint of colour, so it dries back light and misty like this. It makes a really nice foil for the brighter colours of the foreground flowers, which are so vibrant, but yet painted with a very limited palette of French vermilion, mineral violet, viridian hue, and some ultramarine blue deep at the end. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you'll give it a go, because loose flowers can be so much fun. You can really let go and really experiment. And thank you so much to my wonderful patrons in my Patreon group who support this channel. Thanks so much, and I'll see you again soon. Stay safe and happy painting. Bye.